Should Pokemon even have rivals in them anymore? If so, what can we do to make sure that they are always an engaging experience? As I mentioned in my Designing Villains episode, a big part of holding a player's interest and motivating them through the game is about providing a challenge. Ask any Pokemon fan what are the main challenges in the games, and alongside gyms, villains, and champions, they will say the rivals. And no wonder, the role of a rival is a touchstone in Pokemon. Though rival characters serve an important role in any game they appear in, they serve both a mechanical purpose and a narrative one. Mechanically, they give the player a point of comparison to judge their progress throughout the game. Having another character increase in power over time as you do allows the player to gauge where they should be up to at certain points. This goes hand in hand with providing a challenge just a bit stronger than what the player has come up against recently, to make sure the player has improved their skills. This translates pretty straightforward in a Pokemon game since the story is the player character rising to become a champion over everyone else. Narratively, rivals contrast against the player character's views and often shows the flaws in that contrasting view. For Pokemon, the first two generations had rivals that cared more about power and less about bonding with their Pokemon. A very clear contrast. When looking at other generations, we don't have rivals that necessarily have a negative outlook towards Pokemon, but being negative isn't the only way to provide a contrasting view anyway. However, as we have seen in Pokemon, too many times they have lacked contrast or challenge or both, so for this episode, let's get into why and how to fix it. Every episode of my series is about how a reboot could enhance a certain aspect of Pokemon, be it art, world building, or Pokédex, whatever. But for rivals, their problems arise from the fact that they have been reduced down to a formula of design for Pokemon, and there is very little room to change that formula. Every concept that makes up Pokemon begs for a rival to collide with the player, defeating the gyms, becoming a champion, filling out the Pokédex, heck, simply battling with creatures. It is all served well to have the player be pushed, challenged, and even surpassed on occasion by a character that the player can attach their goalposts to. If anything, what does the biggest disservice to the concept of a rival is the fact that there have been so many standalone sequels. It wouldn't have been so bad if you were playing the same character across the generations, because then you could have the same rival or just a few over that time, building those relationships stronger each game as you all grow as people and as trainers. But since each game starts the journey from scratch every time, keeping that element fresh is a real struggle that I don't blame Game Freak for not hitting the mark every time. For the concept of a rival, I do have one idea that my own rebooted Pokemon narrative might bear fruit with. Since the player is taking the role of head of research and the Pokédex project outside of the games, having a character specifically oppose you, the player, gives them very strong motivation to meddle with your understudies. I talked about this in my previous video talking about the laws of Pokemon and how villainous organizations could challenge the Pokemon University, but this could just as easily apply to rivals as well. However, if this was a game series I was in charge of and had to write for this reboot, again, like I said in that video, I would be very careful about how I approached this. I would want to seek the insight of many professionals who have experience with designing strong characters, so I really knew what I was doing when creating a reoccurring rival. One misstep about how you treat any one character along the way for this marathon could really divide and upset your fanbase. You need someone who motivates your players, not make them genuinely angry. There are characters people love to hate, and then there are characters people just hate. Well, anyway, let's get into understanding what makes them tick. I will be having a crack at writing my own rival, as well as designing some new mechanical approaches for them, but that's for next episode. First, let's take a look at how to better design one. Now, we want to design decently written characters and create some general guidelines that can keep that design on track, just like we did in the villains episode. And hey, rivals are antagonists too, so we can just look back at what we did there. What are their motivations? Do their actions support their goals? Do they have a soul in terms of a personality and a story arc? And what can the player learn from them? These are great guides to have. However, there is a problem here. You could write the best character in all of Pokemon's history, and they could still fail as a rival because you didn't actually pit them against the player character. If they are written in a way that their own journey doesn't collide with the player, then having them constantly come up against you will feel forced and unnatural. Plot-related villains tend to have a larger presence in the world, especially if they have henchmen, as their actions tend to affect the game's world profoundly. They are naturally unavoidable. Rivals, however, are much more personal. They affect the protagonist's world. Their motivations and goals might only impact the protagonist's development and not so much interact with the main plot itself. Of course, villains and rivals aren't mutually exclusive. They could overlap entirely if, say, the leader of Team Bad Guys was your rival. So how do we make sure that rivals feel like rivals and not just like small fry villains or reoccurring characters? Simple. They get another set of criteria for their design. I am going to plug and shamelessly borrow notes from another YouTube channel that did an excellent job on the topic of rivals. The channel Design Doc, with their video How to Make Great Game Rivals, puts forward a fantastic criteria list that I am going to use here. Go watch that video, subscribe to their channel like I did, and then come back. Right now. Because here we go. Number 1. Premise. What is their story and why does it interact with yours? How do they contrast with the protagonist? This closely ties into the motivations question, but that added element of why does their story interact with yours is a very important distinction here. For regular villains, it is usually the player that is interfering with them, but rivals interfere with the player. Number 2. Conflict. Does it make sense why they are against you? Is it challenging or interesting? Does it stand out in some way from the other battles in the game? This ties into their goals criteria, but the distinction that they are in conflict with the player is the important focus. Number 3. Persistence. They should serve as the player's motivation, something to overcome. How do they progress compared to the player? Do they actively stand in the way? How often do we interact with them? This also ties into the personality and story arc criteria. Notice how this list mostly adds to the original, but the added context works to keep the design of the rival in line with their purpose. It's a second filter to view the design through. And that's about it, really. We've covered a lot of stuff about antagonists in my 3-parter on villains, so if you haven't watched at least the first one, you can do that to understand a little more about what I'm going to do next, which is to review Pokemon Rivals. I'll be using the 2 sets of criteria I just established and look over what Game Freak has brought us in the past. It might seem unfair to compare all their work to these high standards, but we have to know about what has previously worked, what has not, and what could have been done to improve them. I mean, how else are we supposed to learn? Let's dive into it once again. As a note, I'm avoiding talking about any of the remake versions of Rivals because it can get a bit confusing. First, let's just get Blue out of the way. Doing research on Rivals showed that he is most commonly everyone's favorite rival, or at least in the top 3, and not just because he was the first one. Let's see why. Starting with our character criteria. What are their motivations? To be the best like no one ever was, just like it was for the player. But beyond that, it was also rather personal for him. He wanted to show the world and his grandfather that he was better than you specifically. Do their actions support their goals? So much so that he actually enjoyed always being a step ahead of you. Whenever you walked into a gym, his name was already on the winning trainers list. Do they have a soul in terms of a personality and a story arc? Personality? Check. He's a total jerk. Story arc? Check. You could almost feel sorry for him when Professor Oak gives that line about how disappointed he was in Blue for losing his title of champion so quickly. That said, this story arc doesn't have a lot of depth, does it? He remains stubborn in his callous demeanor through to the end, and we don't really know if he grows from it. Nevertheless, it's a satisfying conclusion. What can the player learn from them? There might not actually be anything complicated to learn here from Blue other than the old-fashioned good triumphs over evil moral to the story. Although Blue has a standout personality, he is a cookie-cutter style villain. He was nothing but a dick, and you get to beat him down. Feels good. Now, let's see our rival focus criteria. Premise. How do they contrast with the protagonist? On every level. Conflict. Is it challenging or interesting? Absolutely. Every time I heard his music as a child, a sweat would break out on my brow, and I would question if I was even up for the beating I was about to take. The fact that his team was fairly well balanced and was typically higher level than any other nearby trainers whenever you encountered him inspired me to do the same. Persistence. Nothing says persistent like interrupting a hostage situation just so you can go another round. Over the course of the story, you could potentially encounter him 8 times. This felt like a good number. Not too many times, but he stands out in the spotlight enough to not be forgotten. Obviously, these are pretty high marks. Game Freak really nailed it on the first try, and I actually have great sympathy for them for somewhat being forced to go outside this format. Having an arrogant jerk as a rival is a natural fit for the gameplay, but after even the second generation, as game developers, you really have to deviate from that. Having a formulaic story might be a quick and easy way to write one, but people will get bored of it and move on. As such, I won't be talking about the second generation's Silver much for this episode, as he is too similar to Blue. However, I will say that his motivations and character development over the game was done a little better. He actually becomes a better person by the end, sort of, and this is even shown through the game mechanics via his Golbat evolving into Crobat, which can only be done with a high enough friendship. However, most times you encountered him felt like an accident or coincidence, whereas you often ran into Blue because he was just leaving the place he had now finished that you were just entering to get started. In my eyes, Silver has a better story arc, while Blue has a better contrast to the player. In terms of persistence, you encounter Silver 7 times, so this rough number of encounters sets a pretty good average that the rest can be judged on. Now, for the sake of time, I will go through these questions again, but we'll do a few rivals at the same time. I think it would be cool to analyze every rival under these questions, but I don't want this video to go for more than an hour. As an additional note, for all of these questions this episode, I don't consider wanting to be champion or fill out the Pokédex by themselves good enough to count as fleshed out motivations. Those motivations have no personal stakes and no personality to them, so there has to be even just a little something more beyond that to count here. To give the obvious examples of this being done poorly, I'll be picking on Generation X and Y rivals. For our mixed results rivals, I will focus on Hugh and Hop. To further save time, for X and Y, I will not talk about Callum or Serena, the player-character rival switch-around. This is because they fail every single question so badly it would be boring to talk about. No real motivations or personality, although you battle them about 5 times, they are not an entertaining challenge, and there is nothing the player can learn from them. Which is very disappointing because it was Game Freak's intention for them to be your main rival that gen. But moving on. What are their motivations, and do they contrast with the player? Tieno's aspiration is to create a great Pokemon dancing team, a fine and thought out motivation, but it doesn't put him in contrast or conflict with the player character. Trevor simply wants to fill out the Pokédex for the region, but is always well under the amount of Pokemon you can catch by any point he checks in. By comparison, Blue did a great job of inspiring and antagonizing the player at one point by stating that he had already caught 40 different kinds of Pokemon when, although the player could possibly do better than that even without trading, they would typically only have about 25 to 30 at that point. Trevor never gives that kind of challenge and shows no personal stake in his motivation. Shauna doesn't actually have any clear goals, but she does enthusiastically support her friends in their pursuits and loves puzzles. Again, this doesn't put her in any contrast to the player, but at least it explains why you would bump into her. Hugh's goal, to summarize, is to get back his sister's Purloin, which was stolen by Team Plasma. He isn't out to become a champion, but beating gym leaders means that he is becoming stronger over time. Helpful for sure when trying to beat up villains. Does this make him contrast with the player? Funny enough, the reason it does is because, like I mentioned in the villains episode, you can't not encounter the people he is out to destroy. So of course, you bump into him and his temper does contrast with your player character's cooler mindset. Hop hopes to one day outshine his league champion brother and to use you as his gauge for success. This is fair enough, although I would like to have a rival with a little more motivation by the 8th generation in the series. Heck, the other 2 semi-rivals in this game do a much better job of that, but at least his desire to beat you is a clear contrast and conflict. Their personality and story arc. Tiano can't ever go a few sentences without mentioning how much he likes to dance and how far along he is to creating his perfect dance team. I assume he succeeds in the end? I don't know. Trevor aspires to complete his Pokédex. And I don't even know if he does. As Shauna has no actual goals or motivations, she has no real story arc. She does have some personality though, in that she shares a bit of a romance with the player character, mostly if you choose to be male. This has never been explored in Pokemon before or since, and I think it would be interesting to do so. I'll tangent here for a moment. Romance might be something engaging for a player in Pokemon, but it would really have to be done right. It would have to be optional, no tangible rewards given for pursuing it like exclusive Pokemon, because there shouldn't be extrinsic rewards related to romance, and they shouldn't be heterosexually enforced. It's fine to have hetero characters in your games, just don't force that status on the player. And of course, keep your options balanced. Overall, you encounter the rivals in X and Y mostly during the main plots of the story to help you beat the bad guys. Unfortunately, that is not really connected to their own personal journeys. They are all just around to be helpful, majoritively as tutorials and exposition as far as I can tell. Hugh has one of the biggest story arcs in all of the rivals, and in my opinion, I think his personality is on par or larger than Blue's. However, coming into contact with Team Plasma is a major trigger for his anger. Now, that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but he is scripted to be rather overly hyper-focused on the task. It comes off a little excessive considering that his sister, the real victim in all this, is not someone we get to know very well or seems all that broken up about it. But despite this, Hugh has his ups, his downs, his internal struggles, and personal growth. Big tick. And Hop. Oh, Hop. His personality is enthusiasm, which can be fine, but it needs to be backed up by something with more substance. Barry, back in Diamond and Pearl, was very enthusiastic, but he also had the attention span of a squirrel, and that made him charming. Hop doesn't really have any major personality markers. What he does have, barely, is a story arc. His enthusiasm does take a hit when he gets beaten and trash-talked by Bede. He even takes Wooloo out of his team during that time. But once he gets his confidence back, it's like nothing really happened. That is, right until the end of the game, when he learns that, in fact, he doesn't want to be a champion like his brother, but instead a professor, which I guess is at least something. Do their actions support their goals? Lightning round. Sort of, I guess. Needs to try harder. What goals, even? So much so that he needs to chill out. Yes, and I wish I was less involved. Which brings us to persistence and challenge. Tiano, Trevor, and Shauna. You battle them 2 to 3 times, and their last battle setup is weird. Towards the end of the game, and in the post-game, you can challenge them with their very leveled up Pokemon. However, this feels really unnatural. Being practically Elite Four ready doesn't really fit their goals, so why would they have such strong teams? Obviously, it is to give the player a unique challenge, but that should not be the only reason, at least from a character's perspective. For Hugh, you can fight him 7 times, but only 5 of them are before the Elite Four challenge. On the other hand, the amount of times that you get to do a team battle with him at least keeps him around quite often, so I'll give him a tick for persistence. Challenge, however, again, those 5 early battles could have been set a bit higher in difficulty, and all I think was needed to accomplish that was for him to take more advantage of the full 6-slot limit. His last 2 fights do, and they're a good challenge, but still a bit late. Over the course of Sword and Shield, you battle Hop 11 times. This is borderline harassment, and came across as rather annoying to repeatedly encounter him. Keep in mind, there were 2 other rivals, Bede and Marnie, who, combined, added another 11 battles to the mix. Hop is overly persistent, and the real shame is that I have never heard anyone say that they were afraid of ever losing to him. He may have given good fights on occasion, but was never really a threat like Blue or Silver constantly were. Let's start rounding up notes for this part of the study. The rivals for X and Y were not really rivals. Game Freak probably would have been better off telling their players that this generation didn't have rivals, but instead just a group of friends who are also on their own adventure. They all enjoy battling, so you get to see how their journey progresses over time. Doing this might have allowed Game Freak to explore new ideas for interacting with these characters that being a quote-unquote rival wouldn't normally allow for, such as doing side quests or unique battle challenges that would impact these characters' outlook on life. When players are told that someone is their rival, they have a certain expectation set with those characters in terms of contrast, challenge, and persistence. Rivals are meant to motivate players towards getting better at a game and giving them someone to compare their progress against. Having characters that are always lagging behind fails to fulfill most of our test questions. As for Hugh, you can see that I have scored him very well here. He has a tick in every box. So why did I put him under mixed results? Like I've said in the past, just because all the prerequisites are met doesn't automatically mean they are a great rival. It also comes down to execution and how well they are written. His goals are noble, but they can be a bit difficult for a player to connect to. Hugh is out to find his sister's purloin. His sister is not a character we get to know well or even interact with that many times. She doesn't even have a name. She is always referred to as Hugh's sister. Hugh is the one we get to know. He is the one we can connect with. It should have been his purloin that was stolen. Whenever the player was doing a favor to Hugh through the story, they were actually doing his sister a favor by advancing that goal, but we don't have any emotions invested in her. We eventually learned that Hugh's late grandfather was the one that caught the purloin, and that right there is all the motivation we need for both Hugh and the player. Imagine if, after the second or third emotional outburst, the player character took him to the side and said, "Hey, you seem to be taking this extra hard. What's going on?" Hugh just sighs and goes, "Yeah, sorry, it's just that my grandfather caught purloin for me before he passed away, and it's all I have to remember him by. He really meant a lot to me." "Don't say another word, you darling child. I will help you." By having it be his purloin, his emotional spikes become more relatable because it is so directly personal. Having those bursts of rage over a character we don't have a connection with is perfectly justifiable from Hugh's perspective, but harder to be patient and understanding for the player. Another thing I will say about Hugh is, again, the only reason we interacted with him so much was because of how unavoidable Team Plasma was. If they weren't, then we would have seen him a lot less. This means that part of the strength of Hugh's character relies partially on the strength of those villains. Finally, Hop could have been a better rival if he had more personality. He could have been a better rival if he grew his Pokemon to levels that were a little intimidating to fight against. He even would have been better if we fought him fewer times. So on and so forth in every aspect. With just a little bit of work and adjustment, Hop could have been a great rival. He just fell short on almost every mark and overcompensated on the last. It is worth comparing the trend of friendly rivals like Hop, Hau, May, and Bianca to Hugh. When you have rivals that are just happy to be here and have no real contrast to the player, it can be a bit of a downer to always keep ruining their day by beating them. Hugh, although plenty friendly with the player, had a real edge to him because of how much he hated Team Plasma. Defeating him actually means we are helping him by showing how to improve, and he wanted to do the same for you because he knew and supported your own goal of becoming champion. This was a real relationship, whereas, for others, it came across as artificial. Before finishing up, I want to call special attention to Wally, a sickly boy with a dream to be a great trainer. When you think about it, he has all the checkboxes marked for a great rival except for just one: persistence. It's kinda surprising that people consider him to be a rival at all when, over the course of the story, you only fight him twice. You fight Jesse and James from Pokemon Yellow more times than that. Why do people put him on the same level as Blue or Silver? Why is he so memorable? He could have just been some side character like Bill, except you get to fight him a couple of times. I believe it comes down to the strength of which he performs the role despite his absence. You first meet him for the How to Catch Pokemon tutorial, establishing the player in a kind of mentor position for him, and you get him a Ralts. Then you battle him later so he can show you how well he has improved, only to instead prove to him that he is still too unwell to go on his own Pokemon adventure, which is pretty mean actually. You learn later that he runs away from home because he has decided that his destiny is for him to choose. Quite the heroic step. And then the next time you see him, he ambushes you on Victory Road. Just before you fight the Elite Four, he has obtained all 8 badges and is looking pretty healthy. This was a seriously missed opportunity in my opinion. His story is very touching as one about overcoming personal handicaps, and the player could learn a lot about how the pursuit of a purpose, whether you achieve it or not, goes a long way towards your well-being. Although hopefully not at the sacrifice of your well-being. Pursue your dreams responsibly, children. We could have had several battles through the story as he strategically used you to gauge how well he performed over time. Just as you were always one step behind Blue in Gen 1, Wally could have always been one step behind you, just entering the place you were just finished with. With every conversation he gains more and more confidence and vitality. What could start as easy wins for the player could quickly turn into a trajectory of difficulty that the player could get nervous about eventually falling behind on. That last battle could have been as high-leveled as any of the Elite Four members, and it would have been all the more memorable for it. Or perhaps even more memorable would have been if, after you defeated the Elite Four and been declared champion for all of 30 seconds, he walks up to you once again to challenge you, and he could very well rob you of the title. Really would have put the player in Blue's shoes if they lost and then the professor arrives and expresses their disappointment in you. Then you can go through the Elite Four again and there is Wally, the current champion, ready to take you on again. Now, to bring all this into the focus of player motivations, when we look back at villains, I noted that villains act while heroes react. By this account, an interesting observation is that Blue and Silver were borderline villainous. An argument can be made that in the first generation, when Blue purposefully picked the Pokemon yours was weak to and then instigated a fight, it was a pretty good inciting incident for the hero. Blue and Silver were always in a position of acting, not reacting. In the case of Wally, although he was always reacting to the villain of his story, his illness, he used you as being his benchmark for success, a boss monster. He took proactive steps in his own recovery, leaving you to simply react to his dramatic progress. In the case of other rivals, they were typically reacting to the events that unfolded with the story just as the player was, and although this is perfectly fine, it doesn't help put them in contrast with the player unless they react to those events in a very different way, like Hugh's temper tantrums, and he was a pretty proactive dude anyway. However, there is one obvious option to future Pokemon games that would impact rivals in a very big way, and that is to not include them. Of course it is possible to go an entire Pokemon adventure without having a rival, and maybe that is what would serve them best. A break. An opportunity to be missed, and when they come back, to have a whole new bag of tricks for them. Rivals have been disserviced greatly by needing to be fresh every time we see them. This only happens because the current formula for Pokemon has relied on your progress never being able to carry over. It's impossible to design and write new and refreshing rivals forever when the core game loop of each sequel barely changes. Every time we consistently get new rivals, the effect of future rivals could be diminished. At the very least, I hope this list of criteria keeps them impactful even if their charm has long worn off. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Next episode, I will actually introduce unused game mechanics and designs that could bring new life into rivals, and then put all this good stuff we learned to write my own rival. Of course, I now look forward to seeing how many people are going to correct my analysis of rivals in the comments, so go for it below. Be sure to do all the awesome stuff that helps my channel. Seriously, please share my videos on your socials. I would love to reach more people, and if you've got this far, you're all I've got. Plus, it makes my Wooloo really happy when you share my videos. Stay wonderful, be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time.